This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis, a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zheng. I'm a psychologist and a research assistant at University of Queensland.
Hi there, I'm Hannah Lindsay. I'm a psychology student at the University of Queensland.
And what we're doing today is we're participating in a big recording project for all the chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we're looking in particular at chapter 21, which is called Environmental and Animal-Oriented Radicalization, Walking a Different Path. And the authors are Jerry Nachtsam and Pete Lentini, both at Monash University. Professor Nachtsam is in law, and Professor Lentini is the director of a global terrorism center. I guess one question people might have is, what is radicalization?
So to define radicalization, they've given this definition: the process of an individual or group making a commitment to realize substantial changes to one or more areas of either an individual society or the global status quo. And it's important to take that definition in the context of this being surrounded with environmental movements. Isn't that right, Winifred?
Yeah, and that's because most of us, when we hear that word, we kind of think of terrorist attacks. And the authors are a bit careful to distinguish in the chapter many possible definitions of radicalization, including radicalization to lawbreaking and violence, but separating out that sense of committing violence against other humans. And as we'll see in a moment, that's because violence against humans is generally not part of radical environmentalist repertoire. But there's an alternate term which is also used, which is eco-terrorism. What's that, Andrea?
So eco-terrorism is a term that is created by the opponent of the radical environmental groups, and they are widely used by the like security firms and also corporations. They are actually destroying the environment, and it was used especially in 1991 by a firm that is accusing the campaign of Greenpeace of being eco-terrorism. And but actually this term is very controversial because the use, just like the definition of using fear-inducing coercive tactics to the end of either protecting the environment or influencing those who are affecting the environment in order to protect the natural resources. And it is actually, this definition is suggesting the use of violence, and also there's a criminal nature of the radical environmental groups. But according to a groundbreaking empirical research in 2017, it suggests that 98% of the attacks is targeted to property instead of human beings, and 99.7% of the percent of that doesn't cause any injuries. And this suggests that the purpose of radical environmental groups is to cause financial strains through economic sabotage, and their purpose is not to carry out to spread anxiety or terror among a population.
That's right. And oftentimes there's a symbolic motive, isn't there? Like, sabotaging or destroying something that stands for the destructive industrial practices, which are being rejected by the group. Just coming back to how people become radicalized, the authors really talk about two different categories of theories, and one of them is process theories. What's a process theory of radicalization, Hannah?
Yeah, so they propose a delegitimization model where basically these individuals are joining a group and then feeling as though the goals that they have aren't being met by that group. And then they're moving on to a more radical movement. And then there was also an architectural approach, Andrea.
Yes, and this is the architectural approach is to radicalization is the process that people gradually build their intention to radicalization radical action, and it is a famous staircase metaphor that suggests individuals and groups go through a 5-stage process in which there are increasingly having sharing the radical views and are more willing to take radical actions in order to fulfill their needs and protect the environment.
Yeah, that's right. And so at each stage, there's a trigger that an individual climbs higher on the staircase, but only a minority of people reach the final step in Vitaly Moghadam's model. And the last process that the authors mention, although it's not characterized as distinct, but as a group researcher, I will call it distinct, is the group process. So the authors highlight that all of the radical groups that they've studied and that we're going to talk about in a moment as case studies actually formed in part by breaking away from mainstream environmental movements. And that's something that Vitaly Moghadam has continued to explore in his later work on which I'm a collaborator. So our work looks at how groups respond to failure and how they can respond with innovation, both towards radicalization and to de-radicalization. Super interesting point of connection for me, obviously, in the chapter. But returning to what the authors had in mind, part of the reason they talk about the breaking away from mainstream groups is because they're about to dive into these 3 case studies. And the first one is the Animal Liberation Front. Tell us about that, Hannah. Oh, sorry. Was it
Andrea?
Andrea? I apologize. Tell us about that, Andrea. Sorry about that.
So the first case study is about the Animal Liberation Front, and this is their purpose is to stop animal cruelty, and they are willing to defend animal rights against the vast industry that have built around as exploitation of non-human animals. And the Animal Liberation Front stands out, and they kind of originate from the failure of more mainstream conservative groups, and which they apply a more nonviolent protest strategies, but it doesn't turn out to be very effective.
Yeah, so even now in all Western societies, these terrible practices of industrial farming impose hardship and cruelty on animals and on an enormous scale. And so activists have been drawing attention to this for decades through petitions and mass rallies and so on, and films like that many of you would have seen. But the reality is those practices haven't changed and animals are still suffering. So the Animal Liberation Front decides to do something different. What do they do, Andrea? Oh, now I'm putting you on the spot, but maybe I'll jump in and say, so they start to engage in tactics like, in some cases it could be breaking into industrial farms and liberating animals, or destroying equipment that's used for these unsafe industrial practices or inhumane industrial practices. And that was probably one of the biggest and first environmental radical groups, animal rights radical groups. But there's another one that they discuss in some detail, and that's the relationship between Earth First and then later the Earth Liberation Front. Can you tell us about that, Hannah?
Yeah, so the Earth First movement began around 1980 with just 4 environmental activists. They were friends, and they just found that the mainstream environmental movements weren't getting the results that they wanted. And they held more of a biocentric view, where they put the environment and nature at the forefront of what they were prioritizing, as opposed to a human-centered view that most other organizations had. And they call themselves a disorganization. So they didn't have official participants, directors, a hierarchy. They just had a goal and a vision. And they quickly grew to about 1,500 participants, I believe. And this group then branched off into something else called the Earth Liberation Front, or ELF, with a few participants that again thought that they weren't doing enough to, but in this case it was to tear down the current political society and make way for their new ideal society. And so that's what the Earth Liberation Front then created, was aiming towards.
And again, we see that process of groups, splintering and factionalizing as being really important in the radicalization process beyond any one individual. That group process, at least that's something I highlight. And then the last example is the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. And it continues the same theme that the founder, Paul Watson, was involved with Greenpeace when they were protesting the activities of sealers. And you guys are maybe too young, but certainly when I was growing up, there would be these graphic Greenpeace photos of poor, beautiful baby seal cubs, and they'd be brutally beaten by people and beaten to death. And that was a reality. That was actually a practice, and it was designed to protect fishing interests. And to a certain extent, there was a fur trade. And so Greenpeace was involved in that. And at one point, Paul Watson was in a confrontation with the sealer, and it kind of, the implication is it went too far. He says he resigned. Greenpeace says he was expelled for threatening the sealer, and he formed the Sea Shepherds Conservation Society, which is very familiar to us in Australia, for what many would see as their heroic ongoing defense of whales in the face of whaling fleets. So as most of you may not know, the whales around the world are protected by international treaties, but not all countries have signed up to these treaties. Many continue to engage in whale hunting. And the Sea Shepherd Society, purchased equipment and boats so that they could interpose their boat between themselves and put themselves between the whales and the whaling fleet so that they could physically stop the whales from being injured. And they've one of the groups that have been labeled eco-terrorists. And the idea here is that they don't take responsibility for the violence because they, don't use any weapons, they don't have any explosives, and therefore they say any violence comes from the other side. For example, they've been attacked and arrested by Japanese Marines. So these are three groups, and I think part of the author's purpose is to highlight in the chapter the difference between the environmental radical groups and the other radical groups, like we've talked about with right-wing extremists or jihad, where there's actually a push to towards violence. And I think you had some reflections on that, Hannah.
Yeah, so they make a good distinction between the different radical groups, where the beliefs that the environmental radical groups hold is that they hold life above all else, above property, above all else. And when you compare that to the jihadists and right-wing radicals that they discuss, they are usually praised for or encouraged to commit violent acts against individuals and may raise up in their hierarchy by doing so. Whereas in an environmental radical group, like we saw with the case of the Sea Shepherd, if they commit any violence, they could be alienated from their ideology and from their group. So that is a really important distinction they make in this chapter.
Yeah. So people in this case, they're radical because they have a desire to transform society, but they don't come to embrace violence because embracing life is part of the ideology, and that puts a brake on that. I think that's a really important point. And Andrea, you had some thoughts as well.
Yes, just as you guys mentioned, like people has a misunderstanding that people who join the radical events is someone who wants to act violently, but that is not the case. Actually, many member of the radical groups are previous members of the non-violent, non-radical environmental groups, but their needs fail to communicate and they feel frustrated. So they kind of moves on and escalated their activities and see radical event as a necessary and effective strategies that they can kind of achieve their purpose to save the planet. So that's the philosophy to justify their radical actions.
Yeah. And I think that raises the question of, who's properly called radical, because oftentimes, as you say, the environmental groups are in the context of having petitioned or used rallies or used scientific research to draw attention to an urgent need for change over a period of decades. And the corporations and governments that are continuing to put everyday business as usual and profit ahead of the destruction of the earth, that could be understood as radical. And sometimes states have even used violence against protesters. So around the world, every year, hundreds of environmental activists are killed in the global south and in campaigns by corporations using vigilante groups, or sometimes by state actors, the army and the police, that will just engage in violence against protesters. So the question of who gets called a radical is rightly questioned by the authors. For me, maybe that's a good place to end, but do you guys have any final closing thoughts? Or
I think that pretty much sums it up.
okay, good. Well, I'll close there, and I'll say thank you to you, Hannah, and to you, Andrea, for being part of the recording. And thank you to our viewers if you've made it to the end of the video. Bye now.
Thank you.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.